an ambush that would go down in history as one of the greatest Russian losses in Africa. It was a place where peasants and shepherds brandished their AKs against trained men, war veterans. At times, Mali saw armored vehicles and modern rifles parade across its arid northern lands, and there they were consumed by the harsh force of war. This is the story of a country where war found its home, and there it welcomed men who made their living from it. Their souls made a permanent home, while their bodies nourished the barren sand. In 2024, the Wagner Group became big news again after more than a year of mystery about its fate following the June 2023 uprising. This time, the news wasn't so good for the group, as it was one of the rare occasions when they acknowledged a defeat so clearly. It wasn't in Ukraine, it was in one of the countries where they arrived as heroes, Mali. There they faced those who I often see here on YouTube referred to as mere AK-47 wielding peasants. People who, at the beginning of the war in Ukraine, talked about how easy it was to face AK-47 wielding peasants and how hard it is to face Russia, as if it was necessary to make this comparison, and both situations couldn't be difficult and deadly in different ways. So here we're going to tell a story to give full context of how AK-47 wielding peasants once again defeated trained soldiers, many of them from special forces. The story to be told here is a long one. However, if you only want to know about the Wagner Group, skip the chapters as they are separated. Some context will be provided first, with a bit of history and some of the main actors who later became supporting characters in the story that matters, the Wagner Group and the Russians. And be careful, this context is provided precisely because there are groups mentioned such as Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, agents of terror and killers who should not be underestimated. Don't confuse the victories presented with heroism or anything like that, no matter which side you're rooting for in this plot of questionable alliances and often hidden objectives. The story takes place in the Republic of Mali, a landlocked African country with a long history of empires and kingdoms until reaching the current chaos. Part of Mali is in the Sahel region, an extensive geographic strip that acts as an ecological transition zone between the extreme aridity of the Sahara Desert to the north and the lushness of the savanna to the south. Mali was once one of the richest empires in the world around 1300 AD, being on the trans-Saharan trade route. It was one of the great centers of Islam and wealth in Africa until it was dominated by the Songhai Empire 200 years later. As there is no empire that doesn't fall in history, Songhai fell to the Saudi Sultanate in 1591. The region's trade routes lost much of their importance after the Europeans began to create navigation routes. But Mali still had its relevance, so much so that the French arrived at the end of the 19th century and stayed. Obviously, no European state could go through this process of domination without some crimes. But then the first uprisings began in the north. And then other groups would join the chaos of war, trying to take advantage. It's important to keep in mind that these groups were victorious at times, allies at others, or even enemies, all depending on how the wind blew across the Sahel. Those who are pejoratively called peasants from here in Afghanistan, the Middle East, or Africa are men hardened by the long history of conflicts in their nations or by the inhospitable environment where their souls are forged. Among them were the Tuaregs. Having lived for years on the edges of the Sahara as herders, but also as fighters, they rebelled against the government of Mali with the intention of taking over the north of the country. Led by the National Movement for the Liberation of Azawad and veterans of the war in Libya, the Tuaregs started a revolt in 2012. They took control of the north, declaring the area independent as the state of Azawad. In a dire situation, no one less than the groups that would later unite to form Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wa al-Muslim, or Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wa al-Muslim, emerged, nothing less than an Al-Qaeda branch in the region. At that time, these terrorist groups were still divided, with names like Ansar Dine or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb. As soon as the government lost the Battle of the North, Jama'at Nusrat al-Islam wa al-Muslim turned against the Tuaregs with their goal of domination and imposing Sharia, or the group of Islamic traditional laws. Those were groups trained in guerrilla warfare and insurgency. The terror they caused in other parts of the world reached the Sahel region and other African countries. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, or Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, made Algeria suffer with its presence for years. A military patrol traveling down the road was attacked so violently that some bodies bled onto the asphalt almost instantly, while the survivors rolled and ran for cover. The men tried to fight back with their rifles, aiming in the direction the shots were coming from, but little by little the jihadists of Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb eliminated those who posed the greatest threat and began to move in to finish off anyone who hadn't yet escaped. They advanced until there was no resistance left. Improvised explosives were a basic strategy of the terrorists. They made the asphalt rise violently in front of the cars. The rifle shots eliminated the one they considered an enemy. The fighters came afterward to collect the spoils. The start of the fighting was sudden. There was no warning for the rifles as the bullets sank into the men on patrol. The stopped car became an easy target. The militants ran for their spoils, recording the horror of the attack. They left with their war groups and signs of victory. None of these targets could fight back. The storm of metal piercing the vehicle's body soon found the men's blood. Desperation drove the car into the ravine, where it took even more shots from the AKs. These shots continued until there was no movement left inside the pickup truck. The jihadists approached to make sure that death had claimed every soul inside the vehicle, and then they came for their spoils. These videos were just examples of Al-Qaeda's methods, which would later be used against other troops. But nothing could be so bad that it couldn't get worse. Al-Qaeda, represented by Dini in the Mali region, felt the power in their hands, marching to impose their version of Islam. Then another threat emerged, ambushing Al-Qaeda in Azawad. Rifles and machine guns filled the air with the smell of gunpowder and the small thunderclaps of flying bullets. The militants were quick, covering the territory. The Al-Qaeda men tried to hide in the bushes, but they were pierced by the bullets. That was the arm of the Islamic State in the Sahel region. It was more terror taking hold in Mali. They were groups that mixed together, among them the Tuaregs, betrayed by Al-Qaeda, which would later be represented by DINIM. Facing so many problems, the Malian government decided to ask for international help, which came with the presence of French troops and later the Russians. France arrived before the Russians, starting Operation Serval in 2013 and was later replaced by Operation Barkhane, which would be much broader in fighting terrorism in Mali. The French troops clashed with the insurgents, mainly focusing on the terrorists. These were tough battles inside the cities, with their armored vehicles moving through terrain full of civilians who could end up becoming targets. It was hard to determine where the enemies were, and the armored vehicles were not always a sign of safety. The Malian troops accompanied the French in the fighting around the corners. The wounded appeared on both sides, being carried out of the fighting that persisted with AK-47 or FAMA rifle fire. The French troops advanced through the country, using the weapons available to silence the terrorists' rifles. Their helicopters and drones took flight to provide cover for the soldiers in their careful advances on the ground. The Tiger helicopter fired its missiles at the enemies, tearing apart the bodies of those who tried to hide in the arid northern mountains. The French missiles exploded in many of the facilities where the enemy leaders were hiding. Over time, many important figures were torn apart by explosions from the French military or allied groups. Adnan Abu Walid al-Sahrawi, leader of the Islamic State in the Greater Sahara, was one of them. Abu Muzad Abdel Wadud, emir of Al-Qaeda, was another consumed by the flames. None of this meant it was easy to face the peasants of Akkar. A bomb blew up a French armored vehicle in the street, forcing soldiers to drag the wounded to safety in the middle of the ambush. Smoke kept coming out of the vehicle as the men tried to look for the enemies and rescue anyone else who was still unable to move. The situation became tense, with wounded soldiers being treated in the improvised cover behind a wall. The French managed to avoid even worse casualties until reinforcements arrived. The rescue spared them from certain destruction. In a way, it was a lucky day. The difficulty of fighting the terrorists and the French reluctance to engage in tougher battles began to infuriate a faction of the government. In 2015, France reached a peace agreement with the Tuaregs. One of the priorities was to try to reach peace agreements to generate stability. The event was praised by the United Nations, and Prigozhin's group played a significant role in its negotiation alongside other government entities. After that, there were more problems over there, but let's get back to Mali. The Wagner Group, a Russian mercenary company also known as the Musicians or the Orchestra, was used by the Kremlin as a strategy to be present in several countries without officially marking Russia's presence in the region. It was strictly linked to the Kremlin without declaring itself as such at that time. It employed a triple strategy to expand its influence. Initially, he manipulated public opinion through disinformation campaigns and counter-protests in senates to reinforce the image of the target government. Simultaneously, Wagner secured financial gains by acquiring concessions in lucrative sectors, mainly precious metal mining, often through affiliated companies. Finally, the group cultivated close ties with the host country's military, offering training, consulting services, personal security, and counter-insurgency support as a way to achieve deeper integration and control. In 2020, Colonel Assimi Goïta and the military carried out the first of their coups d'etat. An interim government was installed. But in 2021, there was another coup in which the colonel was sworn in as president of Mali. The French ambassador was expelled from the country, and the French, facing difficult negotiations with a government that had no date set to return to democracy, decided to withdraw. During that time, the Wagner Group was already active. The mercenaries moved skillfully within Mali. Russian weapons arrived and were received, including Mi-24 and Mi-8 helicopters and Su-25 fighter jets. In addition, Turkish Bayraktar TB2 drones appeared to assert their presence in the skies of Mali. At the cost of $5 million, they could fly at up to 137 miles per hour for up to 27 hours, carrying a good variety of missiles. The troops of the Wagner Group descended from their helicopters under the thick dust of the Sahel, beginning their advances to take the positions of the Tuaregs. One of the objectives was to reach the city of Kidal. The enemies were already waiting for them. Tense hands gripped the AKs, watching where the Russians and their trained men were advancing. The machine guns echoed once again in the Sahel, searching for Russian flesh to tear apart. Improvised weapons mounted on pickup trucks were aimed at helicopters and armored vehicles of the Wagner Group. The drones were active in the skies over Mali. The Tuaregs even saw them, but it was too late when they were hit by the attack. The attacks by the Wagner Group and the Malian troops increased in number, leaving columns of smoke rising into the sky as signs that the Russians were advancing boldly. The Bayraktar drones patrolled the skies in search of enemies, observing and waiting for the right moment to strike at the gathered troops. The strikes were undermining the insurgent forces of the Tuaregs and the fighters from the terrorist groups of NIN or the Islamic State. One of these groups tried to enter from the border with Niger, approaching in groups on motorcycles. The drone cameras locked on as soon as they reached their destination, showing where the missile should strike. The fire eliminated any chance of anyone surviving the attack. Things seemed to be going well for the Wagner Group in Mali in 2021 and 2022. During the war in Ukraine, little changed for the mercenaries there. But then, in mid-2023, Prigozhin staged his insurrection. He even returned to Africa after the events, but at a certain point, it was in the skies over Russia that his plane was shot down, wiping out almost all of the Wagner Group's leadership and revealing the problems that could still be faced. The presence of the Wagner Group continued in the Sahel. There was some panic among the men after the events between June and August of 2023, but then the situation started to settle down. The Wagner Group fell into a shadowy area again with little information about the group, much of it often contradictory. Their flag appeared in Kidal, a city retaken from the Tuaregs in November 2023 in a battle that possibly killed one of their leaders, Aghal Ag al-Mahmoud. The Russians took a good part of the Wagner Group and turned it into the Africa Corps during this period. The musicians' operation was supposed to continue. Wagner proved to be skilled at securing lucrative concessions for natural resources in every country where it operated. These ventures not only financed their operations, but also generated substantial profits. Reports indicated that Russia accumulated more than $2.5 billion in African gold in just 2 years. Some said it was a fair payment, others said it was a lie that the Russians did so. And still others said it was just another country extracting natural resources from Africa while interfering in politics and keeping authoritarian groups in power. But not all glory lasts forever. Problems arose. It started with the controversy involving the French and drone footage of troops associated with the Wagner Group burying the bodies of civilians killed during the fighting. In fact, many accusations began to emerge. The combined forces of regular soldiers and Wagner Group mercenaries surrounded the village of Mura for 4 days, carrying out an indiscriminate massacre of civilians amid their attack on the enemies. It was estimated that at least 300 people were executed. The Wagner Group was implicated in several civilian massacres in Mali. In March 2023, at least 35 bodies were found burned in the village of Dangereo Toro, and soon after, 33 civilians, including 29 Mauritanian citizens, were killed in the Ségou region. In addition, the group was linked to violence against civilians in Diabale, Nampala, Sofara, and Bone. In early September and late October, Wagner mercenaries were accused of rape, theft, and cattle rustling. All the violence helped jihadist groups, as in the case of Dinin, who claimed to have recovered some of the stolen cattle, which earned him sympathy. Yes, this organization, which killed 132 people in Dia Salgo for allegedly collaborating with the government, managed to use the Wagner Group as propaganda. In fact, reports showed that violence increased after the arrival of the mercenaries. Both civilian deaths and the total number of deaths from organized political violence recorded in the first 6 months of 2022 surpassed the numbers recorded in the 2021. More images began to circulate showing admin advancing against Malian armed forces bases in large groups that surrounded the soldiers. The drones captured images of the attacks with cars that exploded near the groups of soldiers. Soon after, Adnin's fighters moved in large groups and in open fields, often being shot down, but with a continuous and determined movement against the enemies. In an attack in Akaran, the base was taken and many pieces of equipment and ammunition were lost to the group. The presence of Wagner did not prevent any of these attacks, including the jihadists claiming to have shot down a mercenary helicopter near Segun. The violence that the Wagner Group delivered, they received back in the form of terrorist attacks. Suicide bombers entered what was allegedly one of their bases in Sevar. They were detained after a few explosions. Shortly after, reports emerged of one of the mercenaries' helicopters being shot down. The Malian forces continued retaliating against Dinim fighters' concentrations using Bayraktar drones. The jihadists did not seem used to the idea of being hunted by these aerial threats yet, keeping their troops close together and in large concentrations. Punishment from the skies came upon them, with fire capturing their souls and sending them off to their promised paradises. Fighting the jihadists with fire, however, did not deter them. They came out of the flames, advancing in their light infantry attacks on the Malian bases, unconcerned for their own safety. The rifles rang out inside what would have been the soldiers' safe positions. The arrival of these men was sudden, and there was no drone to protect the soldiers. Even bases with armored vehicles saw the jihadists approaching in their pickup trucks, aiming their AKs with barrels hot from successive shots. The bodies of the soldiers were left along the way, while the fighters of admin spread throughout the base, taking control of everything and then leaving with their spoils. It may seem that this wasn't Wagner Group's problem on some occasions, but on March 4, 2022, Odenim launched a counterattack, killing more than 40 soldiers in a barracks in Mondoro. The group publicly declared that the fight was retaliation for the Dogovul massacre, blaming both the Malian agents and Wagner for at least 35 civilian deaths, whose bodies were found burned. Notably, Wagner forces were present in the Mondoro barracks area during the retaliatory attack, but they were unable to support the Malian troops. Much has been said about Adnan, but the Islamic State also pressed forward with its jihadists. One of the Orlando reconnaissance drones belonging to the mercenaries was destroyed by fighters from this group. Adding to the chaos, all these organizations fought among themselves, so much so that the Tuaregs tried to prevent the Islamic State from passing through Menaka. This would fail, with the siege of the city later being established by the jihadists. The Tuaregs also persisted with their attacks, taking military bases in the north, even though government tanks were there to try to stop the enemy's advance. In one case, it was said that one of the Malian forces' fighter jets was shot down during the clashes. In fact, one of the captured camps was a United Nations base, which was handed over to the Malians after the French left. The Tuaregs were not willing to tolerate the presence of the Wagner Group.
Rumors emerged that they had declared war on the mercenaries, showing their strength in large convoys.
Rockets were launched against the Russians' bases, but no damage was reported by either side. Soon, even bigger problems would be announced. Instability in Mali persisted in 2024, with the government, supported by the Wagner Group, controlling only part of the territory, mainly in the south and center. Despite recent advances in the northern regions, including the capture of Kidal and Abebara, vast areas remained outside state control, especially those inhabited by the Tuaregs and claimed by the Azawad Coordination Movement. Since July 20th, clashes have intensified with new offensives by the Malian armed forces. The village of Inafarak was the target of a military operation, but the situation there remained tense. At the same time, a Malian military column equipped with armored and light vehicles advanced toward Tim Zawatin, indicating an escalation in fighting in the region. The situation in the north worsened even further with the occupation of Bolguisa by the Malian armed forces. The capture of this city, considered strategic by the Azawad separatists, triggered a new wave of refugees and intensified the clashes. The humanitarian crisis, in turn, led the Algerian army to reinforce its presence at the border. The Malian forces and the Wagner Group faced fierce resistance from the Azawad separatists, which made them request support as the Tuaregs began mobilizing, gathering around 1,000 fighters to defend the city and the mining areas nearby. Few reinforcement troops were able to reach the soldiers, but among the group now formed was the commander of the 13th Assault Detachment of the Wagner Group, Sergei Shevchenko. Nikita Fedyanin, a fighter and propagandist known for the Gray Zone channel, was the first other among them. A Wagner Group volunteer and a veteran of Syria and Ukraine, he knew what to expect from Africa. As they moved, skirting the main road, a vehicle was damaged by an improvised explosive on the road in the Itamasahat Valley, 40 kilometers from the Algerian border. That didn't make Shevchenko give up on the campaign. Neither he nor Fedyanin were impressed by it. It was on July 25th that the war made itself present in all its chaos in Zayantin and put the men on edge. The Malian army column, supported by Wagner, was 20 kilometers from the city when gunfire broke the calm of the desert. Nature willed that blood would be spilled on both sides, preventing the musicians and the soldiers from using their drones and aircraft. The Tuaregs tried to lure the Wagner group into the narrow nearby canyons, where the column would surely be decimated. The jihadists from Nimes were also waiting there, joining the Tuaregs in the alliances that common hatred had generated in the region. Shevchenko was not fooled by their strategy. He directed the column to go around to the east, moving forward and avoiding the dangerous fight in that narrow passage. At night, the gunfire stopped due to the outbreak of a sandstorm, and the Azawad fighters entrenched themselves 7 kilometers from Zotin. The next day, July 26th, the morning returned with fire and blood, once again becoming the main features of the spectacle of war in the desert. The Air Force and drones appeared to try to wipe out the large troops that had formed, but they were not able to. The Wagner Group column moved forward amid the heat of the sun and the fire from the Tuaregs and jihadists. Sources vary, with some mentioning ambushes. Others say that the Wagner Group became drunk with pride from its own fame and sent a reconnaissance group to confront the peasants of Akka. The first vehicle in the column went over a mine. The column of smoke formed in the desert and blood dripped onto the sand as they called for help instead of starting the retreat. The men of Adnindas loaded their projectiles against the mercenaries. The wounded appeared, for whom a Mi-24 helicopter was called, but it couldn't withstand the attacks and ended up crashing in Kidal, although the Russian crew survived. A Mi-8 met the same fate, exploding in the desert and consuming its pilots. Shevchenko went to help his men, with Fedyanin by his side. Their hands were steady on the trigger as they advanced under fire from the jihadists. The brutal attack began shortly after, putting the entire column in a defensive position. Shevchenko must have cursed at that moment as the mercenaries fell into a classic mine ambush, which was widely used by the Afghan Mujahideen against the Soviet army in the 1980s. The jihadists retreated and let the Tuaregs appear. Now almost 100 mercenaries and Malian soldiers were trapped in attacks from 2 sectors. At that moment, the Bayraktar drones weren't there to help them. Fedyanin fell that day at 29 years old. He was there to gather information, not as a combatant. But he met the same end as so many others, with a rifle in his hand. Shevchenko's last radio message, "There are 3 of us, we're still fighting," he shouted. The gunshots ended his transmission. It was estimated that between 80 and 100 people died that day in one of the Wagner Group's greatest defeats. One of the mercenaries was lying among the bodies, maybe pretending to be dead or stunned by an explosion. When he was kicked by the Tuaregs, he woke up confused, making the enemies back away in fear. With his mind disturbed by the horror he had just experienced, he tried to throw a stone at one of the Tuaregs, who responded with gunfire. Shortly after, he was just another lifeless body in the desert. What was once a powerful column with experienced soldiers and local reinforcements became a message to the world that the Rumali War was deadlier than anyone could have imagined, and the hatred of some groups could easily be set aside by the need to attack those they despised even more. Some men ended up as prisoners, but they were exchanged shortly after. The defeat was acknowledged in social media groups associated with the Russian mercenaries, and the stories constantly changed about the actual number of contractors present. The Wagner group and the Malian militants swore revenge, which may mean there weren't just a few of them. Their airstrike hit one of the Tuareg combat posts, with reports of up to 40 dead. Photos and conversations on social media claim that there were Ukrainians at the site who would have helped. However, aside from bravado or conspiracy theories, nothing was confirmed. One of the social media groups, Pro-Guerrilla, even stated that there were no Ukrainians. Thus, the desert was fed with Russian blood in July 2024. This in a country divided with 13 official languages, jihadists, and slavery as an integral part of some cultures. None of this would shake the Russian intentions to remain in the area or the power they would exert over Mali's politics. It was just one more country among so many others that intervened militarily, helped keep a military regime in power, and received part of the natural resources in return. Nothing new on the African front, except for a few pale bodies rotting under the Sahel sun.